Hello, Denton once again with further gripping tales from the lands of Scandinavia, bringing you the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about the Old Norse. Sadly, popular media so often does not. The immensely popular TV series Vikings is a good example of that. A superb cast, to be sure, but it gives a decidedly inaccurate portrait of many aspects of the Old Norse. And one of those aspects has to be the Shieldmaidens, or the Skjaldmaerja, as it is in Old Norse. Now, not the question of did they actually exist as such. We know they did. But rather the way that they are depicted in the show. And that, along with the very powerful character of Lagertha, has opened up a whole debate about the Shieldmaidens. Were they actually as seen in the TV show, or are they simply a romantic product of fiction, a sort of male fantasy of warrior women, more akin to the highly romanticized Amazons of Greek myth than to actual historical fact? Now, I've studied that question quite a bit, along with the participation of women in combat in general down through the ages, which is a subject that is often denied. It's a topic that interests me. I reached certain conclusions on the subject. I've spoken about this previously on my other channel. So, did Shieldmaidens actually exist? Well, the answer is it's a very contradictory one. No, they did not. Absolutely not. Pure invention of storytellers sitting around the fire on a winter's night. And yes, they did. There's ample evidence of that, both historical and archaeological, as well as in the sagas. Now, there's a bit of a problem there, don't we? That's quite a conundrum. Yes, they did, and no, they didn't. Talk about hedging your bets. Well, to explain this seemingly, impossible statement, one must take a quick overview of historical fact. And it is fact. Women have fought in wars since the dawn of recorded history, though men have tended to very conveniently overlook that fact when they felt it somehow reduced their own manliness. The mighty alpha male did not take kindly to mere women, those chattels who should just serve their men and obey, their every command, doing things that he considered only he could do, given his, great strength and power and all that sort of thing. So female participation in actual combat tended to be very conveniently overlooked or just simply swept under the carpet. And I'll be looking at the question of a woman's ability to actually fight against a man with ancient weapons before firearms made a level playing field when it came to that sort of thing. But that's in part 2 of this video. So watch out for it. It's very interesting, even if I do say so myself. And I do, of course. And, I have first-hand experience of it. I have seen what women can do in combat. I've actually fought against them. But those women in antiquity tended to do their fighting as individuals rather than in military formations. Now, that's not to say that military units, including or even composed entirely of women, never existed. They did. There is ample historical evidence of that. The forces of both Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan included female warriors. The strongest warrior in Kublai's army, according to Marco Polo, in fact, was his niece, never beaten even in wrestling against men. Well, some Indian rulers had female bodyguards, not unlike those in the Black Panther movie. The African kingdom of Dahomey had an entire regiment of women, famed for their bravery as well as their savagery, putting down opposition to the king with considerable brutality, which was very effective, and later fighting a gallant but doomed battle against French colonial troops. And there were female samurai in Japan. In fact, one of the greatest samurai warriors was actually a woman, famed for her strength and courage, Tomoe Gozen, known as the Beautiful Samurai. But most women who went to war in times past did so singly or in small groups, and usually in response to a developing need, taking up arms, defending a town or village if the men were away, or fighting alongside the men if the situation was becoming serious. Now, while they fought as warriors, often very well indeed, they were not warriors in the true dictionary sense, we could say. It was not their profession, though that fact was hardly much comfort, I should think, to anyone they killed. If you got a sword or a spear shoved through your guts, I suppose it made little difference whether it was a man or woman at the other end of it. You were just as dead either way. There's an old Scottish saying that men are natural warriors, but a woman in battle is truly bloodthirsty. Now, I wonder how they knew that. That's a wee bit of a puzzle, isn't it, lad? So, while individual Norse women certainly would have joined in battles if the need arose, or they were simply caught up in it and didn't have any choice. If someone is about to kill you and you have a weapon, well, you do what you can. Large numbers of Shieldmaidens, rank after rank, in similar uniforms and all carrying matching identical shields, marching off to war, banging drums with banners flapping in the breeze. Well, that's highly unlikely to have occurred. The considerable numbers shown in every large battle in Vikings is almost certainly exaggerated. Women in every single battle, every shield wall, dozens of them on both sides. But having said that, there is evidence for at least one group of women in Scandinavia who were very much the Shieldmaidens of the Vikings TV show. And we have that from no less than Saxo Grammaticus, or Saxo the Learned, writing in his Gesta Dunorum, the history of the Danes, circa 1200 AD. And he is recounting historical facts, not mythology or retellings of saga stories. He writes, "There were once women in Denmark who dressed themselves to look like men and spent almost every minute cultivating soldier skills. They courted military expertise so carefully that anyone would have guessed that they had unsexed themselves. Those especially who had forceful personalities, who were tall and elegant, tended to embark on this way of life. They put toughness before allure, aimed at conflicts instead of kisses, and desired not the couch but the kill. And those they could have appeased with looks, they attacked with lances." So, there was at least one full military group of women in Denmark. But, Saxo didn't like them. No, he didn't like them one bit, despite his account of their seeming military prowess. And later in his Gesta Dunorum, he says about the warrior women that they put their hands to the lance, which they should rather have applied to the loom. But, you see, to my mind, the fact that he didn't approve of it, felt it was wrong and unwomanly, yet stressed the fighting ability of these women, actually gives credence to it. Why would he invent something that he disapproved of and then write about it in a way that made those women look good? Hardly. Then there is a very interesting story from the 8th century regarding the Battle of Bravalla between Sweden and Denmark, in which 300 female warriors were said to have taken part, even naming some of them. There was Hedborg, Visna, and Hed among them. Visna is said to have had her arm cut off while carrying the Danish banner, and a warrior named Vigborg was credited with killing a champion male warrior. But historians are divided as to whether the battle was a real one or simply symbolic. An actual historical event of it can't be verified, nor the exact site of where it occurred. But, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter if the battle actually took place or it didn't, because that story of Bravalla, real or not, and Saxo's Danish warrior women too, women he didn't like, yet about whom he wrote in a complimentary manner and didn't try to make them seem, incompetent or always beaten by the men, that raises an interesting question, and that question is concept. The concept of 300 female warriors going into battle, or indeed any woman at all doing so for that matter. Why would something be mentioned that couldn't exist? Women taking up arms are mentioned many times in the sagas, which seems odd if they never actually did that. Of course, the Norse sagas are dismissed as little more than fairy tales, anything contained in them of no more historical value than the writings of the Brothers Grimm or Hans Christian Andersen. But that overlooks a very important point. While those things in the sagas dealing with gods, magic swords, dragons, and such like are clearly largely mythological in nature, things related to everyday life and customs are not. They will reflect the actual things that people did. And this is where the concept of the female warrior comes in. Concept and the acceptance of it is very important. Something that never happened, indeed couldn't happen in a male-dominated society, would not be put into sagas and poems so many times and shown as being perfectly normal. Nor would the women be mentioned as successful warriors. Usually on the winning side, in fact, not depicted as inferior to the men and always losing to the men. In fact, it's usually quite the opposite. Why would they do that? These references in the sagas are never seen as unusual or out of the ordinary. Other characters never seem surprised by them. They accept an armed woman as a perfectly normal thing. They never say, "Why is there a woman fighting amongst us?" Or, "Oh, we are ashamed that our women must fight for us, that we men have to hide behind their skirts. Oh, the embarrassment, the humiliation." No, they seem to take not the slightest notice of it. It is worth considering also that in such a male-dominated age, would it not seem that one might expect, even if women warriors were mentioned, that they would always be defeated, that men would always conquer them every time, no matter how good they were, they would never beat the men, thus showing, their obvious female inferiority, as is the case with the Amazons of Greek legends. Great, powerful warriors. But great though they are, in the end, they always fall to the male warriors, because men naturally had to win. This is not found in the sagas and the poems, where women are often shown as very good indeed, frequently beating the men or holding their own against them. That would not be the case if it was something that would have raised eyebrows in actuality, something that could never have happened. Nor would it have been seen as a taboo, something that would have been seen as a taboo subject by the men. So let us take a look at some things from the sagas, where I think the concept principle does come up, and this is something that I've not really seen mentioned elsewhere. But first, before actually we look at the sagas, remember that the sagas were originally verbal tales, pagan ones, recited by poets, male and female, called skalds, and they weren't written down until hundreds of years later by Christians. The church frowned on many of the rights and privileges that women had enjoyed in pagan times, and there's a distinct possibility that references to women doing something that would not have suited the Christian viewpoint, well, like being warriors, for example, may have been watered down or even omitted altogether. Given that, what the sagas do tell us is all the more interesting. Incidentally, the term Shieldmaiden is found only once, I think, throughout the sagas, yet its frequent use today might make one think that you'll find it on every page, but references to female warriors as such are common enough. When Skadi's father, the giant Thjazi, is killed, she puts on her armour and takes up her weapons to go to Skjaldmaerja to seek vengeance. And it is clear that they are her war equipment, not someone else. It's that she's borrowing. It's not a case of, "Oh, I say, Olaf, might I borrow your sword and armour? Just a few people I have to kill, thank you." No, she has her own weapons. Yet no one is surprised that an armed woman turns up ready to fight. "Oh, there's a woman in armour with a weapon outside wanting to fight someone. Oh, how do they..." No, they don't seem totally surprised by that at all. It's also interesting to note that none of the gods seemed to want to take her on, all of them staying inside Skjaldmaerja, where the shedding of blood, of course, was prohibited, so they weren't going to actually come out and fight her, which says something. In the Volsunga saga, Gudrun dons armour, picks up a sword, and joins her brothers, Gunnar and Hogni, in battle, fighting alongside them. Yet neither of them, nor anyone else, seems to see anything unusual in that. They don't say, "You're embarrassing us, go away." No, she is accepted beside them in the battle. In the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, we see that when his two sons by his first wife, Thora, are killed in Sweden, his second wife, Åslaug, goes as a warrior herself, dressed in chainmail, with her sons by Ragnar to avenge them. She wearing chainmail and leading a large force overland as her sons go by sea. And again, This is not seen as strange or unnatural. Her sons don't say, "Please go home, mother, you're embarrassing us," and the enemy will laugh at us being led by a woman, or anything of the kind. And sorry to spoil a romantic idea from the TV show, but Ragnar was never married to Lagertha. No, sorry about that. Of course, since Ragnar probably never existed, I don't suppose he could have been really married to anybody, but we're not really here to discuss that. Nor are many other mentions in the sagas of women fighting seen as anything but perfectly normal. There is a story of Hervor from the 13th century, Hervor Saga och Hedrix, a woman who was as strong as boys and turned her back on female things, learning swordsmanship, archery, and horse riding before dressing as a man, taking a man's name, calling herself Hjorvald, and going Vikinger, fighting and killing as she raided and pillaged around all over the place. Now, she later travels to the island where her father, a famous warrior, is buried in order to retrieve his magic sword. Only she is brave enough to land on the island, her crew deserting her and taking her ships when they hear strange noises coming from the island. But she goes on, ignoring the monsters that are said to lurk there, breaks into the tomb and demands the sword from her undead father. Now, he's reluctant to give it to her because it's cursed. Once drawn, it cannot be sheathed until it has tasted blood, and even the smallest cut from it anywhere on someone's body will be fatal. To be honest, if I'd been her, I'd have let him keep the thing. But anyway, she persists, and eventually he gives her the sword, and she leaves to have adventures as a great warrior, And she serves King Gudmund for a time, continuing her Viking ways. Eventually, she tires of that and goes home, reverting to the role of a normal woman, marrying the king's son and having children. But is this seen as something wildly unusual, something unheard of? No, it isn't. The idea of a woman being a warrior and a Viking raider, that is, again, the concept. As to the undead part, I really don't know. But we haven't quite finished with her yet, or at least her descendants. Hervor's granddaughter, Hervor Hedriksdottir, followed in her Viking warrior grandmother's footsteps, becoming a fine shield maiden, skilled enough to be made the commander of a fort that faced what was called the Dark Wood, an area that formed a boundary between the Huns and the Goths. She was later killed when she led the army against the first assault of the Huns in a great battle between those two warring factions. Yet another example of the acceptable concept of a strong female warrior and a military commander as well. Now, why would such tales have been written if these things could never have happened in reality? Hardly, I should think. And nor, as I have said, even if they were recounted, why are the women shown as being capable, brave, good warriors, like Hervor leading an army, being the commander of a fort? Why would they write about women in such a complimentary way if women didn't do it, couldn't do it, and they wouldn't have approved of them doing it even if they did? Remember, this was a very male-dominated society. Masculine prowess was valued above almost everything else. So tales that glorified women in combat must be regarded as being fairly close to the truth. They hardly made them up just to make the women feel better about themselves. That would be highly illogical. When Leif Erikson's men were attacked by the natives in North America and were having a hard time of it, retreating in the face of the attackers, his famously ferocious sister, Freydis Eriksdottir, 8 months pregnant at the time, ran out and shouted at them, "Why run you away from such worthless creatures? Stout men that ye are, when it seems to me likely you might slaughter them like so many cattle. Let me but have a weapon, I think I could fight better than any of you." No, they ignored her, but like Gudrun, she picked up a sword one of the men had dropped and charged at the Indians, bare-breasted, driving them off. But Leif doesn't seem to have been in the least bit surprised by that, nor unduly upset at having a pregnant woman rescue his men. Freydis, of course, was no stranger to violence by a long way, and on one occasion, when she sent someone to kill some men who she wanted out of the way, and they didn't kill the men's wives, well, she became rather annoyed about that, and she went around with her axe and she killed the women herself, because the men thought it had been a bit dishonorable to do that. Yes, she was not someone to mess with, certainly if she had her axe close by. We know, too, that it was possible for a Norse woman to be known as a drenge, which meant a bold, reckless warrior who lived by a code of honour, a term that Dr. Jackson Crawford, a noted expert on Old Norse, defines as somewhat similar to calling someone a real badass today. And there are some women referred to as such in the sagas. It is quite interesting that, a woman could be referred to in that way. We may ask, if a woman could not and never did fight in any form, how could she be called a drenge? That fact is, I think, quite worth noting. Now, I saw a comment by one expert, and there are, of course, a great many of those, redoubtable keyboard warriors who fight fearlessly. And he said that just because one woman picked up a sword, as he put it, that meant nothing. It didn't mean that women were warriors. Quite apart from the fact that he clearly failed to notice that a number of women were said to have done that, not just one. So much for his actual reading skills. It raises a very interesting point regarding women and weapons, whether any of them were warriors as such or not. How did these women know how to use the sword after they picked it up? When Gudrun, for example, picked up a weapon, how did she know how to use it? Sword fighting isn't like using a gun. I mean, any fool can point and pull the trigger. A 10-year-old can do that. But using a sword requires a certain degree of knowledge, especially if one were up against skilled warriors who knew what they were doing. Does that not imply that Norse women must have had some training in the use of weapons, even though there's no actual record of that? Without some knowledge of weapons and at least a degree of training, any woman just grabbing a sword and rushing into battle would have been killed in a matter of seconds. So too would any man who did the same thing, for that matter. Untrained people wouldn't last very long against men who devoted much of their time to training and to fighting. No amount of courage replaces knowledge. Yet, none of these women are killed. Now that's something impossible for anyone completely untrained. So it seems to me that the use of weapons must have been something that was quite familiar to Norse women, given the way it is written about in the sagas. And something, of course, that the saga tellers would have been well aware of, as would their listeners, so there really would be no need to explain that fact. But more than titles that they might have or references in the sagas, there is some genuine historical proof that Norse women could take part fully in male activities. The first comes from a Greek historical record entitled The Synopsis of Histories, which reviews the reigns of the Byzantine emperors from 811 to 1057 AD. In 971 AD, Sviatoslav I of Kiev, ruler of the Kievan Rus, the Vikings who had settled in what is now Russia, Belarus, and the Ukraine, invaded Bulgaria, which was part of the Byzantine Empire at that time, bringing female warriors in his army. During the siege of Dorostron, the Rus forces were reduced to near starvation, and a force of some 2,000 warriors, including women, made a surprise sally out during the night to search for supplies, and they managed to defeat a Byzantine force on the way, returning later to the city. After the eventual defeat of the Rus, the Byzantines were astonished at finding the bodies of armed women among the fallen warriors. That fact alone I would put forward to prove not only the acceptance of the concept, but also the reality of the Shieldmaiden, if you want to use that term. Skeptics, of course, claim that the women were just soldiers' wives, or they were camp followers, they were prostitutes, whatever, who grabbed up weapons and took part in the fighting. Yeah, right, okay. I think the Byzantines would have been able to tell the difference between armoured warriors fully equipped in proper fitting armour and camp followers who were in normal clothing, who just grabbed up a sword or put on a breastplate that was 4 sizes too big for them. I don't think the Byzantines were quite that stupid. Then there's an early 12th century Irish text, which is called The War of the Foreigners with the Gaels, which mention a Viking fleet landing in Ireland in the late 10th century, led by one who they call the Red Maiden, who the Irish characterize as one of the most dangerous of the Viking leaders. Now, no name is mentioned, though she is sometimes regarded as possibly a Norwegian woman named Rusla, daughter of the king of Telemark, who gathered a Viking fleet after her father was overthrown by the Danish king Omund, attacking Danish shipping in revenge. She went on to raid Denmark, the British Isles, and significantly perhaps Ireland, gaining a fearsome reputation as a bloodthirsty individual who took no prisoners, gaining herself the name the Red Woman in the process, accompanied by another woman called Stikle, who gave her name to the Norwegian city of Stiklestad. She was eventually brought down by her own brother, after King Omund promised him to, persuaded him, I should say, to change sides by adopting him as his foster son. He was said to have grabbed her by her hands and held her as his men beat her to death with rowing oars. Yes, well, what a superb example of brotherly love. With relatives like that, who needed enemies? Now, it does seem unlikely, however, that she was the Red Maiden of the Irish tale, since that woman died in Ireland, and Rusla obviously did not. There is certainly a similarity. Another interesting thing to consider is the fact that women carrying shields and wearing animal heads are depicted taking part in the procession on the Osberg tapestry, dating from 834 AD. And one would have to ask, well, why shields? That does seem to suggest a combative role, that these women were Shieldmaidens, either in the actual sense or symbolic. And even if it's the latter, that would once again raise the question of the acceptance of the concept. With that, we come to the end of part 1 of this look at the Shieldmaidens. As they used to say on those old TV serials, stay tuned for another exciting episode. Oh yes. In part 2, I shall be looking at the archaeological evidence for the actual existence of the Shieldmaidens, or at least of women in combat, and dispelling the myth that women were not big and strong enough to fight men. A mantra, of course, beloved by the alpha male. Now, I personally know 2 women who do just that, and in modern, rule-restricted combat with blunted swords, unlike women 1,000 years ago, where no rules, of course, would have applied, and the weapons would have been sharp, which would make a considerable difference. I've actually fought against one of those women myself in reenactment, I hasten to point out. And I can certainly verify that they were more than capable. So, until next time, I shall say farewell, goodbye, for now.